Welcome to another episode of Jerry and Rick Discuss Life and Other Things. Our guest today is the Chancellor of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Ronnie Green. We'll have an academic discussion about our continuing interest in civil discourse, not from the perspective of his role as Chancellor, but rather based on his personal views, grounded in his years of academic service. I'm Rick Alloway.
And I'm Jerry Renaud. Thanks so much for joining us today. We are continuing on our series about civility and how things have changed over the time that Rick and I have been at the university, and in general in politics, education, sports, all areas of life seem to have changed in some fashion, and it continues to disappoint us that that's where we are as a society. And so our podcast series this year is going to be about civility and how that has changed. And again, one of the things that we really want to focus on is how can we make a difference? How can we change this? How can we find ways to create conversations and find some middle ground? So even though people are disagreeing about subjects and about topics and about politicians, can we find ways to intellectually discuss these differences without it resorting to name calling and other kinds of things there? So that's what we all are about. And we have really a very special guest with us today. It is the Chancellor here at Nebraska, Ronnie Green, who has agreed to come on and talk to us about issues in civility and education and how those things have changed. So thanks for being with us today.
Great to be here, Jerry.
Really appreciate it. I'm not going to get into specifics because I always say Rick and I have been in education for years, and I know you have been in education for
years.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, how has it changed from you? And you've spent a lot of this time as an administrator. How have you seen things change over the years?
Well, first of all, universities are a place where you do discuss differences and where you learn about different views and different perspectives, along with all of the facts that you learn in knowledge-based fields as well. So that's who we are. It's what we do. First of all, that's the environment that we're in, and we want that to be part of the environment. You're here to learn. You're here to learn how to think and how to be critically evaluate and think, to be informed citizens moving forward, right? So I just start with that as a foundational base in the discussion here. I've had a varied career, so I've been I've been around for a long time. To put it in perspective, I'm in the third decade of my career, the latter part of the third decade of my career. And I've been in a lot of different environments. So I was a college professor for 15 years. Early in my career, I was in private industry for a number of years, in roles there in a couple of different ways. In private industry, I was in government for a number of years before coming back to higher ed and being an administrator these last 8 years. Things have changed a lot. Relative to how we have discussions, relative to the way that people express themselves, relative to the way that they seek to understand issues. And I would say that, it's fairly, I don't think I would be stretching it at all to say that civility, the definition of civility is I'm not even sure what that is now. Maybe
That's a tough one.
Yeah, it's a tough one because we have discussions about that in the university about civility is defined as what? To me, civility is the ability to have a discussion about important things where there are multiple different perspectives on those things, but be able to do that in a way that is without fear, without animosity, without the tense environment in which we find a lot of things now.
Yeah, I like all of that, and I used to tell freshman students all the time that this may be the last place where you get this great opportunity to read and discuss the great philosophers of the world. You get to read Shakespeare. You get to talk about all of these things, because once you get out of college, life changes. You have spouses, you have a job, you have commitments, you are busy, and you don't get the opportunity to do those things. I'm worried sometimes that people don't think anymore that that's a good idea.
Yeah. It's obviously a lot of personal opinion that I'm giving you.
Oh,
here.
sure.
But one of the things that I've noticed that's really changed over time is the way we get and consume information. So I don't want to paint a cause and effect kind of picture here, but it appears to me that we have developed into a culture where we consume information within our own chambers, right? And where there's almost a little bit of it's been described by some as a little bit of a tribal kind of culture, where, if we believe these certain things in these certain ways, that we go to where we will be reinforced with that, and not hear the other perspectives or not hear the other views. And I sense that as a change that is out there.
And why is that? Why do you think that has happened? Or has it always been there, and now for some reason it's more prevalent?
I don't know that I have a explanation for it, but it certainly appears to be the case to me, where that's the way conversation seems to be occurring, and different platforms for the way that happens, right? I'm a habit of reading the newspaper and reading news and consuming news and knowing what's happening in the world, and it's increasingly difficult to do that outside of these echo chambers, if you want to think of it that way, right?
Yeah.
So that's a change, I think, that I've certainly observed. There is a side to that where I go to who or what I'm most like. I give you another observation. This is more of a technical observation, and it's a really puzzling one to me. Now, this is Ronnie Green as a scientist talking to you here. So in my field, there is a fair amount of controversy in the food and the agriculture world over things that are fact-based things, right, where we know these facts that are based in sound science, based in clear observation, irrefutable, but depending upon which chamber you're in or what your view is in putting it into a context basis, your interpretation of those facts is different. So it's almost like there's been a lot of discussion about truth and what is in our contemporary culture and in recent years, and alternative facts and what is truth and so forth and so on. I started seeing that 15 years ago, where the same fact would mean something different to different people. The fact didn't change, but the interpretation of the fact changed in a way that was driven by a particular agenda. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And I'll give an example of that. Example of that is genetic technology and crop improvement, genetically modified crops. The facts are very clear that that is a very positive, science-based, no detrimental effect, technology that should be used. But it is a very controversial technology that is painted as being bad, inappropriate, and wrong, in just exactly the opposite case of what the facts show. Does that make sense?
It does.
And the context around that depends on the interpretation of the interpretation of the fact. Is the context around it is used in an entirely different way, and there is no middle ground, right? So
Right.
does that's just
Yeah.
one example.
Yeah, and the no middle ground. That's
Right, that's kind of the theme of our series. And let me take that a step further, because one of the things that goes past the different interpretation of facts that we're seeing is a seeming inability now to even agree on a fact set. That you have one faction saying, no, it's not, and the other faction saying, yes, it is. And I just recently was hearing about the unearthing of a fossil horse that was stuck in the permafrost that they have now dated to 40,000 years old, preserved in pristine condition, and they're looking at it to be able to really do a great study of what life was like at that point. But I know I have friends that will say, well, life wasn't around 40,000 years ago. The Earth is only 6,000 years old, and they firmly believe that. But yet you have scientists who have devoted their entire life to the study of the planet. And that leads me to asking you for a little bit of elaboration, because as we're broadcasting and podcasting this series, the university is on the cusp of entering into our sesquicentennial year. And for 150 years, science has been a huge cornerstone to what we do here.
Right.
And that scientific method not only encourages but requires doubt to say, fact check me on this. And I'm not going to take what I think happened here as absolute science until it can be replicated and proven the scientific method, as you were talking about with genetically modified crops. But are we still capable of that when you have because one of the things we do in our own college is really work with students on critical thinking skills, which you alluded to earlier. How do we split the difference between telling students we're not challenging their personal beliefs when we ask them to critically examine those beliefs or their comments or their work, that is part of the scientific method and is not a personal attack on their beliefs?
Yeah, well, it's that's one where I'm pretty black and white, Rick. It's there is scientific method, there is definition of how you obtain facts, how you prove facts, and how you stand behind the truth of those facts, realizing that those facts are going to constantly be reevaluated and added to, all right, in context. That's what science is, right? As one field of study. So I'm pretty black and white on that. This is the method. This is the approach. This is the sound basis of that method. And then it's once you know what those facts are, you interpret those facts. So that one's clear to me. Where it challenges a belief set, right? That's okay. For it to challenge a belief set. The prime example you use is Galileo's finger, right? And the old ancient story now for us almost about what it took to show that Galileo was right? And within the context of, right? So scientific method in that case, very early days of scientific method. So that one for me is pretty simple. It's very black and white. It's not. I don't have a lot of room for interpretation on that one.
So let's move into then an area like, say, political science, where you have, because that is, I think, the source of one of our biggest divides right now is left versus right. So when you're talking about a political science class, or in our case, the journalistic coverage of political issues, which people can and should be very passionate about, again, we need to come to a point where we can say to students and faculty, we can have honest discussion and honest disagreements, but they're not ad hominem attacks. They're not personal. They're just a difference of, to go to your earlier example, which side of the fence we're looking at.
Yeah, it's, I'll wax a little history here. So I'm a big fan and have been my whole life of American history. So read American history as a little kid, and I grew up in Virginia, in the seat of colonial history in the U.S. and so forth. So go back to the founding fathers of this country, right? Go back to the Congress that ended up writing the Declaration of Independence and writing the Constitution of the United States and the Bill of Rights. That, go back to that period of time. And you read the history there, and you read the way that those discussions occurred, and you read the differences of perspective and opinion that even that group of founding fathers had. We certainly contemporarily have studied Hamilton a lot because of the most recent
right.
Portrayal.
Introduce a whole new generation to it, probably.
It's imagine what that would have been like. Now, that's my definition of civility, right? And we can have differences. We can really thoroughly disagree on perspectives, but in the end, those differences are put aside for understanding the greater good, right? So that's that's the way I go back and think about this. And if there is a moving away from the ability to do that, understanding what's causing that is I know a lot of the conversation here, that's what I think about more. And at the same time, as a leader of a great land-grant university like Nebraska, assuring that we do not lose our ability in higher education, and in having the platform for that to occur, and the platform for students to learn and to be able to have those kind of conversations with all of the perspectives, for them to reach decisions. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
One more thing on the politics, because I think that is really fascinating. Even into 50s, 60s, Congress could have differences of opinion and grand arguments on the floor of Congress, and yet after everything was said and done, they would go out, have dinner together, they could carry on conversations, they were friends. And I believe it was before President Obama became president, but he wrote a book and he said he thought some of that was because we had an experience, a group experience that brought us all together. So, and we had these series of these. So founding fathers, it was trying to get our country going. Then we had issues with the Civil War. Then we had issues with World War I, World War II. They had this shared experience. Have we lost that shared experiences? I mean, is that part of why?
I hope not, right? I'll say that first and foremost. I hope not. I believe that we shouldn't have ever lost that. Senator McCain's death in the last period of time here, most recent period of time here, has caused a lot of conversation about that. Or not caused, but a lot of conversation in remembering Senator McCain and some of the things that he said in the last part of his life, on top of his career, right? And if you read what he said in that last few weeks of his life, his kind of parting message to the greater public, he talked about those shared values. He talked about what it meant to be an American. He talked about how we don't all agree, but that what binds us together is that we are all Americans and we believe in this country. So I hope we haven't lost that, right? But when there is an opportunity to divide into camps in a way and platforms that allow you to do that, and you become very convicted in the way you feel or what your perspective is on various issues, and then it becomes about the other side more than what the issues are, that seems to be a pattern that is troubling. That's again, and I think Senator McCain actually used this word in some of his language, and I've heard others use it. Mitch Daniels, one of my peers who's the president of Purdue University, I've heard him use this word recently, of tribalism seems to be the new norm rather than the exception. Right. So at any rate, I hope we never lose our shared values.
Well, and finding that middle ground does mean, and Jerry and I talked about this in an earlier podcast, finding something on which you can agree. And a couple of examples we used were Antonin Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg were fast friends, dinner companions, based around a shared love of opera. And I think you could say they were fairly polar opposites in terms of some of their thoughts on the law, but they got along famously and laughed and enjoyed each other's company. We also talked about two former representatives of our state, Bob Kerrey and Chuck Hagel, who were served together, opposite sides of the political fence, but their shared experience was their Vietnam experience. And so I think it's noteworthy that they will actually be coming to campus here in within a few weeks to talk about
very,
that.
very happy about that. And I'm sure some of their conversation will certainly be along these lines about what it means to be an American and civility is in our discourse. So former Senator Kerry and Governor Kerry and former Senator Hagel and Defense Secretary. I can only imagine what an interesting conversation that will be from the two of them, who I think have modeled that throughout their careers and their lives. I had the opportunity to do an interview of Senator Hagel about a year ago related to activities in China around our Confucius Institutes, and we did a series that public television aired, and he was one of the interviewees, and he's a model for this. He's a model for how you have civil discussions where you don't agree on everything, but where the greater good is what's important, rather than your own individual perspective where you might disagree. I was also going to mention that I spent a lot of time reading this summer because trying to understand the greater world we're living in is part of my job, right? And I'm trying to understand how the university also is a reflection of the greater world that is out there. We've had our own, I think, challenges associated with this kind of decay of civil discourse. And I've read a book by John Meacham, who is a well-known political scientist in his own respect and writer. And he's going to be on our campus as well this fall, giving a lecture, I think, in October here. And the book was a kind of case study of leaders in different times of the development of the United States. So it kind of started with Lincoln, in the time of the Civil War, and as Lincoln was coming into being president of the United States, and a little bit of his background as a politician from Illinois prior to that. And then it progressed through different eras of time where the country had a challenge of one sort or another, right? So it had Teddy Roosevelt was one of the case studies, Woodrow Wilson during the World War I era that we're 100 years behind now this year. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, all the way up to the current time, right? And the point that Meacham was making in the book was that there have been multiple times of tension and strife of different forms and varieties in our country's history, where civility and discourse has ebbed and flowed in different ways, where there have been very, very strong feelings about various challenges and things the country are dealing with, or have been dealing with. For example, on our campus here at the University of Nebraska, in that time period around World War I, there was significant unrest on the campus. There's actually a play written about that called Sedition, that if you go back and you study the history of the university, that had to do with faculty and the Board of Regents having a difference of opinion on what civility was in that time period related to World War I and related to whether we should be involved in World War I. Then you fast forward about 50 years and you look at the Vietnam era, and a very famous time in our history as a nation, certainly. I was a little boy at the time. I still remember distinctly remember every night Walter Cronkite, the news. You had supper at, I grew up on a farm, so we had supper at the end of the day, and we would tune in to Walter Cronkite at 6:30, and we'd hear what was happening in Vietnam. That was the routine thing about the horrors of what was happening in Vietnam and all the unrest at home about that many people will remember. Well, we had our unrest here on this campus.
Indeed, we
it's
did.
Part of our history associated with the occupation of the military science bill. You'll remember that history. So there's various forms of the way that civility looks, feels, plays out, associated with different challenges that have been there. I don't really know that I fully understand this one, what it is that's caused the separation that is there. Some might argue it's economic. Some might argue it's difference in education. I don't know that I buy all of that, but something is causing this kind of global feel for the need for separation. Does that make sense?
It does. And one of the things
and
that...
I can't put my finger on it, but there's something systemically that is causing that, because it's not just here. It's not, we see it all over the world to some level and some degree. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Do you think, because one of the things we want to talk about is solutions, do the leaders have some sort of obligation in this country, whether it's political, whether it's yourself, whether it's sports heroes? Do those people have some sort of obligation to help us here?
Jerry, I think we have an obligation, and I would say this as a leader, but I would say this as a citizen too, right? We have an obligation for the next generation, certainly. So very much in our radar as a institution of higher education. We have the obligation for teaching people, maybe that's the right way to say it, how you have civil discourse, what civil discourse is, why that's so important, what that means. Now, I will tell you that in the last 2 years, 3 years of time, that there's conversation occurring all over the country. It's not specific to Nebraska. I hear it from all of my colleagues all over the country. I hear it from colleagues outside the U.S. about, do we need to have a different approach to talking about civics? Do we need to have a different approach to talking about what civil discourse is? Do we have to have a different approach to exposing and having our students' minds framed around that? We're talking about that here too. Are we doing everything that we can and should do for understanding the importance of civil discourse? Don't have the answer to that yet, but we're certainly talking about that at a level that we wouldn't have talked about that 5 years ago in the same way, because of the nature of the way that things have occurred in more recent times. So I think we have a leader certainly has an obligation there to appreciate and understand how you should be able to have conversations and dialogues and educational environments where everything is evaluated and learned from, right?
And certainly the media outlets, we are always looking at what role do we play here and how can we do our job better, because we're not blanket defenders of what we do here either. We want to figure out the right way to do it. And you mentioned the historical time frame that with World War I and even more particularly with World War II, and radio is really coming to its ascendancy. And the people around the dinner table heard Ed Murrow reporting live from London during the bombings. Right. And you mentioned Cronkite and what was perceived by some historians to call the first living room war, because you were watching the horrors unfold in video in front of you. Now we have social media, which has ramped up the immediacy of that discussion and the conversation, and everybody, for better or worse, is a publisher and a content producer. I see France is just now, within the last couple of weeks, they're barring any mobile devices until you're age 15 from schools. You can't even and teachers can't use them in schools either, and during the day, because they feel they're distractions and that they're keeping people from learning.
Yeah. Again, while we're philosophizing on the world here.
Absolutely.
Jerry, you asked a question very early in the conversation here about what has changed. Well, that certainly is a major change. All right. Well, we have become consumers of information in these circles of all these different media platforms that we didn't have. You know, I'm an old Encyclopedia Britannica guy, right?
World book for us.
Yeah,
You know,
there you go.
you have to go work to look it up,
Right.
and you have to then interpret what you looked up, and as a part of that process, there was a process via which you assimilated, learned, and evaluated information that was methodical and thoughtful, right? And anybody my age will know how that, you know, how you feel about that, because that's the way that you develop your sense of decision making, right? Now it's on the fly. Everything is on the fly. You know, certainly my life is on the fly. Every person walking around's life is on the fly. So decision making is different, even at the minute level, than it was 20 years ago, than it was 10 years ago, than it was 5 years ago. And there's not that thoughtful, pragmatic, evaluate, think, decide process that is like it would have been in that time period. Now, there's good and there's bad in that, right? The world moves at a different pace, all of that kind of, everyone has the same information, there's a lot of good in that. But I do think we have lost some of our thoughtfulness, and we've lost some of our ability to think through the way you reach a decision and the way you have a conversation, rather than reacting to without thought. Does that make sense?
But that process you just described is exactly what universities are supposed to be about.
Exactly.
And so how do we
reinforce the need for that?
Yeah, because it's only going to get
we
worse.
reinforce the process. Yeah.
This is only going to get worse. We're going to have more information, and part of the problem is deciphering which bit of information is right and which is wrong, and what is good, and all of these things. But if we look to the freshmen coming in 5 years from now, I mean, they will have had 5 more years of new technologies, abilities to do these things. And if that is causing bad decision making, where are we headed?
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting to watch, right? So we live in a free enterprise society where ideas create, you know, new opportunities, right? That's the whole idea of free enterprise and capitalism. It's the bedrock of this country. So we can't even imagine what it's going to look like 5 years from now. So I'm going to be visiting later today with a group of academic leaders, and we're going to be having this conversation about now planning in higher ed. You know, planning for 5 years from now is we have to try to do it.
I can't even
but
imagine.
Planning for 5 years from now is somewhat of a moving target, right?
Oh, yes.
I'm not embellishing that. It really is. All of the things that we hear about and see in statistics that say that most of the jobs that our students will have in the course of their lifetime have not yet to be created.
Yes, and
Yeah,
universities...
it wasn't like that for us.
Oh, no.
Right?
Universities used to work at a much slower pace, where we would always go, well, we're working on the bulletin and the curriculum for next year, but it has to be done by... And you
Right.
go, look, there's
So,
going to be
which
all these
says
things.
something about the way we have to educate our students, too,
Yes.
right? It
Yes.
says
Oh,
something
yeah.
about the old model of the way we learned is different than the way perhaps we're going to need to think about and adapt to. We all constantly are adapting the way that we deliver higher education. We do things today that we would have never dreamed of doing 10 years ago in pedagogy and the way we teach and the way we interact and engage with students. But that's going to only escalate from here. So I'm very interested. What I started to say a minute ago, I'm very interested to see what happens around a lot of the media platforms that we have today. I don't have a clear picture of what that might look like
Neither
10
do we.
years from now.
Well, but it's interesting that you mentioned changes perhaps in civics education as part of this, because one of the things that we're actively involved in here in the College of Journalism and Mass Communications is this concept of increasing the effort spent on media literacy among students and among adults for that matter too, because not only do we have more information, to your point, Jerry, but we also have, we know, dedicated attempts at misinformation and disinformation. And this knee-jerk, got to respond right away now without even bothering the second source. We've all probably been burned on thinking, oh, that's something that somebody said, and turns out, no, it wasn't. That this is more important now than it has ever been. And that may be one of our solutions.
And again, going back centrally to what's come up here several times in the conversation is the need for the individual, right? So the citizen, the student, the individual, to be able to think and make clear decisions and that will never go away. And how we continue to do that in a way that exists in this world that's very different, right? Within the context of this world that's very different and it's changing. That may be one of the greatest challenges higher ed has, to be very candid. It may be our great challenge that lies ahead of us. So don't know I have any of the answers, but it's been a great conversation.
Well, the one thing that has changed as well, because we'll have this continuing conversation, is I don't know that it's changed, but perhaps it's amplified more now, is whether or not universities really are open within their borders to multiple viewpoints, or whether or not we are indoctrinating students. I continue to hear that term, and that's one that always just makes what little hair I have left on the back of my head stand up. That professors are indoctrinating their students. And I've told colleagues outside the university how insulting I think that is to students, to think that they're that easily led. These are sharp people, and they will not be just pushed down some avenue with which they do not agree. But how do you, when you talk to folks outside of our university setting, how do you allay fears that this is not a campus, or universities in general are not places where multiple viewpoints are welcomed?
Well, a couple of different ways. One is the idea of a university. The concept, the very bedrock of a university is that it is universal. That it brings everything together in an environment, right? So you can slice and dice that lots of different ways, whether that's ideologies and perspectives, fields, disciplines, areas of study, breadth of knowledge. All of the word university is based on universal, right? Universal understanding and universal, the word universal. So that's one. So we, by default, are a place where everything exists.
By definition.
And by definition, we're a place where everything exists. Whether students are being indoctrinated, or using that term, being indoctrinated, I don't buy that at all. For various things you said, Rick, one is that these are free-thinking, bright, articulate people who are seeking to learn and understand. If there's anything that worries me about some of the conversation that seems to be out there about universities being places of indoctrination, it's that students, there is a little bit of a change, I think, in students over my period of time,
absolutely,
in how much students want to challenge, how much students are putting themselves out there to challenge, because I think there has been a little shift there where students aren't as willing to challenge as they used to be. I don't think it's because of the academy. I think it's because of a change culturally in the way that they think and interact, and both amongst themselves as well as with the educational environment. That worries me more, right? So again, back to civil discourse, and is embedding in them that you should challenge. You should ask. You should seek to understand. You should not accept at rote value anything without thinking through it very, very clearly. Does that make sense?
That's part of the scientific method again.
Absolutely part of the scientific method. So, I don't buy into the fact that we're indoctrinating people at all. That requires one to believe that the human spirit is indoctrinable, or is able to be indoctrinated. I don't believe that. So,
without extending this another hour, I do want to ask you what role in this civil discourse you feel diversity plays, because that's one we're dealing with in a not always totally diverse state, but one that is becoming more diverse. What role does that play in helping expand and enlarge upon civil discourse?
Well, certainly, diversity is absolutely a great thing, right? And again, being true to the word universal, whether that's diversity of background, diversity of culture, diversity of belief system, diversity of race, diversity of gender, however you want to look at it, that's a very positive thing. I do think we also have to be really careful, though, the way we talk about diversity. I think sometimes we pigeonhole it into one meaning, right? And I'm much more a believer that diversity, inclusion is the important word there, as much or even more so than the classic way diversity is often described. Inclusive means everything. Inclusive means truly everything. It doesn't matter what your background is, your race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, all the things we use to define those words, or diversity is defined often those ways. It also means how you grew up. It means whether you grew up with a lot of resources, without a lot of resources. It's also what your background has been and what your experience has been across the board, right? So to me, it's all of that includes the full spectrum.
Economics, geography, religion,
absolutely.
Lack of religion.
Right, yeah. What another country in the world you're from.
Absolutely.
But all inclusive, right? And that is only a good thing and a positive thing no matter how you measure it. You're going to learn more and have that diversity of background and experience.
Well, we certainly appreciated your time today, Chancellor. It's a delight to talk with you, and we look forward to all of the things coming up for the university's 150th celebration, which will include a lot of these activities.
We're going to be celebrating 150 years of impact, of access, of inclusion, the way we've delivered on that mission for the state of Nebraska and beyond. It's very, very exciting to be going into that year.
And how things are going to change.
How things are going to change. How we've had this N150 commission working. In fact, they're on campus today as we're doing this podcast. They're on campus working on a number of different areas of our new strategic plan that I've kind of pre-read the original draft of, and I'm pretty excited about. Excited about a lot of things, including some of the things we talked about today. So.
Excellent.
We'll look forward to continuing the discussion.
You bet. Thank you.
Our guest, Ronnie Green, Chancellor of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm Rick Alloway.
I'm Jerry Renaud.
And join us again next time for another episode in our podcast series on civility in civic discourse. Thanks for listening.